1. I do not like spending my free time asking adults to make good choices. It makes me sad that some politicians use trans kids like me to get votes from people who hate me just because I exist. From Kai Shapley, a transgender 10-year-old from Austin, Texas. 2. Anti-trans groups get an incredible amount of space in public discourse and the media. From Owl Fisher, a non-binary journalist and trans rights campaigner. And 3. This is a long one. We're exhausted from constantly having to debate our existence, and we're exhausted by constantly having to self-advocate in the face of ignorance. Trans woman or woman, trans men or men. If people can just keep that in their minds and go forward with that thought, then, we might just get somewhere. Progress takes time, but it should not end with us going back in time. From Anna Murphy, a trans woman and 2S LGBTQIA+ activist in Calgary. Hi, everyone. It's Taylor. Happy Trans Awareness Week. Those are 3 very important quotes I wanted to make sure you heard first before anything else. Full disclosure for anyone who knows me well enough, normally I kind of go off the cuff. In this case, I did have some material put together, so if I do seem a little lost or out of focus, I'm trying to pretty much read a script. So please bear with me. Ultimately, for Trans Awareness Week, instead of me just speaking, what I chose to do is go through news and articles and pretty much all forms of, hey, here's what's happening in the world today over the last 12 months. And longer, if necessary, if relevant to the story that I'm putting together. The reason behind that is the trans community has been under siege for so many years, and I've mentioned that already, since 2015? And from bigots, from hate groups. Enough's enough, and it is time to evolve awareness into activity. Through everything that I put together, I did the best that I can to maintain the spirit of every single citation. And you'll take a look in the description of this video. I'm going to have links for every single article that I've referenced against, that I might have tweaked the dialogue so that it fits the flow over numerous articles, so that it all sounds kind of to be coming from the same sort of root, I guess. But ultimately, the messaging is the same. And please look at these articles that I've linked, as there is so much more information inside every single one that is critical for allies and people who want to educate themselves better on trans rights, trans visibility, trans awareness, to understand better what is happening in the world that very likely they hardly know exists. So before I get too deep into this, I want to say thank you to all of the writers who I have used their stories to help build a large one. And to all the interviewees who have provided incredibly meaningful quotes or insights to share, whether it's their lived experience or their professional experience about the trans community. This is going on Taylor's clock, so if you know me well enough, this is not going to be brief. But how do you put the chaos that has existed not just for 12 months, but for months and years? How do you compress that into a handful of minutes? So if you can make it through to the end, thank you as well. In the description, I'm going to do the best as possible to make sure that there are bookmarks, I should say, to go towards each, let's call them chapters. I did the best that I can to have a flow so that there are story elements that speak to each other, and then you can see what they are and jump forward, or if you need to come back and revisit, please do. Speaking of revisiting, if you've been following any of the campaigning from either myself or my grassroots group, Higher Weller, Please continue to advocate with that. If you have not yet, a link is in the description of an action page to ask political leaders to demand a higher standard of corporate social responsibility from organizations inside their communities so that there is not just a better tolerance towards the 2S LGBTQIA plus community and of course the trans community inside of that, but what that also does is it is economically viable to be morally aligned on a social compass. It makes money. So let your political leaders know that it is important to maximize the corporate social responsibilities based on the community, not based on the organizations who operate in it. Links in the description. As with everything, please don't hesitate to forward, to share, whether it's this video, hit a subscribe, please follow, please share the message. Please make sure to communicate this to your peers. Please make sure to accompany us on our other platforms. Again, links in the description. And let's get into this. As I mentioned, I'm going to do the best that I can to pay attention both ways. So everyone knows to get started here, the camera is backwards when it comes to reading, so I most likely am going to be staring at something on the side. For the first time in a large-scale Statistics Canada household survey, the Survey of Safety in Public and Private Spaces, SSPPS, included questions about the sex assigned at birth and the gender of respondents. In 2018, 0.24% of those 15 years of age or older provided responses indicating that they were trans, i.e. their sex assigned at birth is not the same as their gender or gender non-conforming, i.e. neither male nor female. Again, citations there, links below. Transgender Canadians were more likely to have experienced violence since the age of 15. And more likely to encounter inappropriate behaviors in public, online, and workspaces than cisgender Canadians. Trans individuals face unique stressors, including what some trans individuals experience when their gender identity fails to get affirmed. Across Europe, Canada, and the United States, 22 to 43% of trans individuals report a history of suicide attempts. Trans individuals also experience higher rates of discrimination and harassment than their cisgender counterparts and, as a result, experience poorer mental health outcomes. Trans individuals are 2 times more likely to think about and attempt suicide than LGBT individuals. 1 in 3 trans youth attempted suicide in the past year. 67% of transitioning individuals thought about suicide pre-transition, and only 3% post-medical transition. Which brings us to this week. Each year, between November 13th and 19th, people and organizations participate globally in Transgender Awareness Week to help raise the visibility about trans individuals and address issues members of the community face. Transgender Awareness Week is a week where trans individuals and their allies bring attention to the community by educating the public about whom transgender individuals are, sharing stories and experiences, and advancing advocacy around the issues of prejudice, discrimination, and violence affecting the trans community. Trans advocate Gwendolyn Ann Smith founded Transgender Day of Remembrance, TDOR, as a vigil to honor her memory of Rita Hester, a trans woman who got killed in 1998. The vigil commemorates all the trans individuals lost to violence that year and began a meaningful memorial. TDOR occurs every November 20th. At least 350 trans individuals were killed globally in 2020. And Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide, or TVT, noted an alarming trend in the murders of trans and gender non-conforming individuals since they began their annual analysis in 2008. In the UK, transphobic hate crime reports have quadrupled over the past 5 years. And 2021 is on pace to be the deadliest yet for trans and gender non-conforming Americans. Put this number into perspective. 350 trans individuals worldwide. Using that number with 0.24% of Canadians from the age 15 plus identifying themselves as transgender, that is 12 out of every 5,000 people. Recognize now how many trans individuals are being murdered in comparison to how many trans people there are. Not surprisingly, 2020 was the most violent year since the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, records began. And the Human Rights Organization called it an epidemic of violence, along with the American Medical Association. If you saw one of the citations down there, the title from Forbes, Murdered, Suffocated, and Burned Alive for Existing. There is some stuff I have that's not on cards. According to data gathered by TVT, a research arm of the advocacy network Transgender Europe, at least 350 trans and gender non-conforming individuals got murdered between the beginning of October 2019 and the end of September 2020. The period evaluated annually through their trans murder monitoring project. The total represented a 6% increase in reported murders from their count in 2019, when 331 trans and gender non-conforming individuals lost their lives due to hate violence. TVT's analysis showed that 98% of those murdered globally were trans women or trans feminine individuals. In addition, people of color made up 79% of trans individuals murdered in the United States during their research timeframe. When examined globally, 38% of the murders occurred in the streets, while 22% of the incidents took place in the victim's home. The average age of those killed is 31 years old, with the youngest victim being 15 years old. A further humbling and critical part of the context we must view these figures is that with this death total, it's likely the tip of the iceberg. The numbers are not comprehensive, as it only includes incidents found online and those reported to TVT by local activists and partner organizations. Many cases of anti-trans murders aren't known to the public because they're either unreported or misreported, with many victims being dead-named and misgendered. Misidentifying trans individuals can disrupt a police investigation, preventing community members from helping identify victims, and damaging the relationship between law enforcement and the trans community. Does that make sense? Does it make sense in any context that when a trans individual loses their life due to hate, that they might not even get the respect of having their life recognized properly? The number of police-reported hate crimes in Canada increased by 37% during the first year of the pandemic, rising from 2019's 1,951 incidents to 2,669 in 2020. Not nice. This information marks the most significant number of police-reported hate crimes since comparable data became available in 2009. Police reported 17% more cybercrime-related harassing and threatening behavior violations in 2020 from a year earlier. The police reported CSI and crime rate include only those incidents that come to the attention of the police, either through reporting by the public or proactive policing. The 2019 General Social Survey on Victimization found that 29% of violent and non-violent incidents get reported to the police. So, to turn that around, 71% of incidents do not get reported to the police. Could we wonder why? Tracking hate crime statistics against trans individuals in Canada is more difficult because there's, one, no dedicated organization following these details. While gender identity or expression as a motivation for hate crime got amended in 2017 through Bill C-16, we continue to see little or no data collection in the topic, which continues to look over gender minority communities like trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming individuals. This exacerbates the lack of information and underreporting within these communities. The 2021 census was the first census in Canada to count trans individuals living in the country. A census, however, is not the same as what the police organizations choose to report details with. Monitoring hate crime against trans individuals is complex because police stations are not safe spaces for many trans individuals. That's why 71% don't get reported. Before the new wording in the legislation, police had not kept an official record of hate crimes against trans and non-binary individuals. The invisibility had troubling implications for our criminal justice system. With no documentation of the violence we experienced, there was no need for the government to act. By not explicitly naming the violence, the state demonstrates complicity in the invisibility and violence that trans and non-binary individuals face. When police institutions ignore the existence of hate crimes, it sets up an environment that enables more violence and harassment. Barbara Perry and Ryan Scrivens from the Center on Hate, Bias and Extremism at the University of Toronto Institute of Technology analyzed a series of police interviews. They found police were generally apathetic around the rising threat of far-right hate crimes. I can say from personal experience that the Winnipeg Police and RCMP put the pathetic in apathetic. In addition to the neglect paid to any known right-wing extremism presence, some police personnel deny, at least publicly, that there is any risk associated with the extreme right. Those police personnel trivialized the extreme right potential for growth and violence. TransPulse Canada's report on health and well-being among racialized trans and non-binary individuals in Canada had found that among respondents, 72% had experienced verbal harassment in the past 5 years. 45% had gotten harassed at work or school, and 73% worried about being stopped or harassed by police or security because of who they are. I, in the big picture, am a rather well-off trans individual. I might not have $1 billion, but financially stable is an open word, but I'm certainly not struggling when it comes to having my ends meet. I'm white. I carry privilege. And the police are still nonsense. I can imagine how difficult it would be to even look at a police officer in the eye if I was to be a person of color, let alone a person of color dealing with discrimination, with harassment, with threats, with abuse. The enablement that the police allow for hate within their own organizations before they even pretend to care about solving it for those who are relying on them is pathetic. Often, trans individuals are misgendered, called by the wrong name, and mistreated by police. Trans individuals experience different forms of hate, violence, and all these different things, and not many of them reported for the same reasons of not being believed or just having to go through a transphobic system. This is from Yasmin Persad. I hope the name I pronounced it correctly. Trans program coordinator at the 519. Now, I've got incidents, however they are in the system, with the Winnipeg Police. The last time that I phoned them to follow up with an incident, I discovered, not by any of the detectives or officers that I've been dealing with, but through somebody through administration, because their phone circuits really suck when you need to get through, that they continued to use my pre-transition name, not my legal name. They kept my legal name as an alias. My legal name is Taylor LaChrist. There is zero reason to maintain my pre-transition name as still something to be the primary, because it is not legal. So imagine this. Imagine a trans woman going to the police system for assistance. Hey, I'm on the receiving end of threats and abuse and violence. Please help, because those are the things you are overpaid for. And they go, yeah, okay, sure, except they don't. But then you find out that they don't even give you the dignity and respect of recognizing who you are. And I'm on the phone with the clerk because they're verifying me, right? Like to call about an incident. I'm like, yeah, no, my name's Taylor. Like, right? No, my name's Taylor. Is that on your driver's license? You bet it is. So the police can't even make sure that their information is in sync with the information that they use to verify an individual. Think about that. Think more about that. Think about how useless and pathetic our police are for dealing with the trans community, because they can't even give a trans individual the respect of recognizing their name. We live in a society that ranks human value according to a hierarchy of bodies and identities, where disposability radiates outward as a person's distance from the hegemonic ideal increases. Trans victims, especially BIPOC trans victims, are targeted because their identities place them far away from privilege. And the social structures that uphold this complex compound oppression and ultimately place them in disproportionate danger. It's from David Johns, the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. With 2 LGBTQIA+ communities witnessing a record high number of hate crimes in 2019, the Canadian government and society need to be more proactive in addressing these incidents targeting sexual orientation and gender minority communities. Every year, the data paints the same picture, yet there is an inadequate response from the Canadian government on addressing this violence in a meaningful way. And that's from Egal. It is illegal to discriminate against trans individuals in Canada, yet trans individuals experience daily discrimination in the community. Derogatory comments, refusal of medical care, denial of services, verbal and physical harassment, and violent assault are examples of the kinds of direct and indirect discrimination encountered by trans individuals. Many trans and non-binary individuals worldwide faced reduced access to gender-affirming resources during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, causing a decline in overall mental health and furthering the healthcare inequalities these individuals face. There was mounting evidence to suggest that measures to reduce the spread of COVID-19 exacerbated the healthcare challenges faced by trans and non-binary individuals, from the cancellation of gender-affirming surgeries that were perceived to be elective, or having to move in with unsupportive relatives and spend more time living to their sex assigned at birth instead of their actual gender. I want to put a really quick stop on this right here, that anybody who thinks that this is some sort of way to advocate the idea of screw the protections, screw the vaccine mandates, no, screw you. Because what you're doing is amplifying that message. Now, however it goes for whatever your beliefs are, that is a completely different argument. But fundamentally, the world, the globe, operates with the expectation and understanding that COVID-19 is a real thing, that it makes people sick, and it kills people, and it hurts people, and it is a priority. And because of that, there are individuals who do have to take a number, regardless of the fact of your beliefs. And so if you continue to keep that messaging up, to keep people from getting the health services they require, I don't think you can get more selfish than that. Myself personally, I've mentioned it many times in many other videos, I don't have genital dysphoria. So when it comes to an orchie, that is by definition an elective surgery at the present moment. Should it be? Hell no. Hell no. But I'm okay with waiting. As a matter of fact, I'm actually next in line for that. Hooray! For the individuals who have an insane discomfort from their body and need the medical services necessary so that they can have their body align with their being. And they can't, because of all the doctors, the nurses, the beds, the availabilities, the medications, the time, the whatever, that is not available because of the amount of people who are taking up spaces in medical facilities because of their refusal to acknowledge a global pandemic. There are people who are sacrificing their time and their lives, and they might even become victim to dealing with their own discomfort, they lose their lives because of their discomfort and their inability to go ahead and make it through another day because their body is not congruent with their mind, but they have to take a number because of some selfish prick who feels that government's... Stop it. Stop it and recognize who you're harming and how you are harming. So that quote was in no way suggesting that everything has gone too far when it comes to COVID, because the only thing that has gone too far is the privilege that is given to people resisting medical safety and security. Gender-affirming care, mental health, and economic stability are all related. And to look only at yourself and feel that because you are feeling uncomfortable because of how the globe is operating, while there are trans individuals suffering through their day-to-day lives because of the bodies that they were born in, and they can't get the access necessary to get the bodies that they have the right to because of that selfishness, is beyond me. Trans communities who already face a myriad of health inequities experience even further health burdens due to restrictions imposed during COVID-19, like reduced access to gender-affirming treatments and mental health resources. To move forward, we need to support trans communities with policies that make gender-affirming healthcare affordable, accessible, and recognized as essential. And that last part is important because for myself, as I mentioned, I am more than okay if I got a phone call saying, Taylor, we have to postpone your WRHA because there is an urgent need for COVID patients to be taken care of. I can comfortably say, okay. It's frustrating, but okay. I can do that. But there are individuals who can't, and that should be way up on the ladder. Because if we're going to deal with everyone else's comfort, that is the near epitome of comfort when it comes to the affordability. Myself personally, I'm on 3 medications that comes to, at least out of my pharmacy, $400 every 3 months. I'm grateful that through my workplace, I've got a benefits plan. That all gets taken care of. Not everybody has those same benefits, pardon the pun. $400 every 3 months to help me feel whole, to help me feel comfortable. So think about when it comes to something like COVID, where people lose their jobs, they lose their income, they have limited income. They have to decide what's important and what's not important. And can you imagine needing to decide if buying food or buying essential medication for your sense of self and well-being, and you have to decide which one you can afford? Government and everybody around us need to understand that and do better. Evidence suggests that trans individuals in Canada are medically underserved. Barriers range from lack of provider knowledge on trans issues to refusal of care. The entire spectrum of gender-affirming resources and services, from haircuts to hormone therapy to surgery, is crucial to trans and non-binary individuals. These resources and services activate and enhance the interactive process of receiving recognition for one's gender sense of self and feeling of humanity. When it comes to the being medically underserved, I can share personal experience on a few ways. For one, when I started transitioning, one of the first things that I did was actually use the family doctor finder to look for a new doctor. The reason behind that was the doctor that I had, in the big picture, nice guy. My vibe did not feel like he would have provided me the care that I needed. When I was getting my shoulder looked at years ago in a past life, that when an MRI came back with inconclusive results, even though that I know something screwed up with it, my athletic therapist knew something was screwed up with it. My physiotherapist knew something was screwed up with it. And for him to go, no, not yeah, well. So from that type of care already let me feel like I didn't think that he would be able to appreciate the news of, so I'm trans, how do we do this? So family doctor finder set me up with a new doctor. Cool, fine, dandy, except for the fact that getting my name recognized on the Manitoba Health card was problematic in itself. And to my best understanding, because I have yet to hear feedback from Manitoba Health Division or whatever it is, even though my physical card says X on it, I believe I remember reading something in one of my emails previously that somewhere on their side, it still says M. That's not right. That's very wrong, as a matter of fact. When I was at the facility that I go to now for the very first time, even though I did all the whatevers, and I made sure to make it explicitly clear that, the new card and everything's on the way. And so filling out the forms, and I made sure that, of course, by following the health card, it has to stay according to what it is legally, even though that my legal name at that period of time was Taylor, sitting in the waiting area to get triaged by being called by my previous name. Broadly, even when it comes to something like clinic, trans healthcare at clinic, took ages to understand my name was Taylor Lachrist, to not use half names, like a place in our city for trans health care, to not have that hammered home about how to handle names is beyond me. When I went for a laser, exact same incident like I was just explaining about the doctor's office. Sitting in the lobby, get called up as Brad. Needless to say, as soon as we went to the room, the very first thing that was asked is like, do you have a preferred name that we would use instead? Right? Well, yeah, let's get you set up. But those shouldn't have to be after the fact. Those should be pieces of information that are understood long before the experience actually happens. Why is it so complicated to have what seems to be so fundamentally straightforward, so excessively complicated for everybody except the actual patient, the client, the trans individual? Why is it so complicated for a very straightforward system to act straightforward? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer questioning people experience various forms of implicit and explicit discrimination and harassment because of their sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity. It is essential to be aware of subtle and often unintentional messages that imply that dominant cultural norms are correct. Assuming that everyone is heterosexual, or that their gender and sex match, or that they identify as male or female can stigmatize those who don't identify with traditional labels. As a result, they may feel excluded, unaccepted, disrespected, ashamed, insulted, invisible, unsafe, or unwanted, resulting in a reluctance to provide private and personal information or even seek care. It is essential to be more aware of language in healthcare, ensuring respect for all people. Healthcare organizations have a moral obligation to establish a safe and respectful environment for all. This is an open letter to WRHA. I asked you to follow up about this and you have not. I put this in here on purpose. I challenged Deer Lodge Center, where I had a referral for speech language pathology, voice training. I didn't care about my voice, but hey, if I can go ahead and just pick up some tips and tricks for free on Manitoba's dime, cool, why not? As part of the program, first, it was an incredibly cold experience. I did not get a name. I had a number, along with all the other clients. We all had numbers. We weren't allowed to get to know each other. We weren't even allowed to know the rest of us exist. We were all numbers. And not only that, the material they provided in handouts had transphobic language, referencing material from, as I believe it was 2015, some study something transgenderism. They were providing transphobic dialogue to their clients, referred to via trans health care. And I challenged them on that. And not only did I challenge them on that, but I challenged them on the principle of speech language pathology because of the dialogue that they used was so explicit about male and female. And in 2021, when non-binary individuals, let alone so many other gender identities, are valid, that the dialogue was explicitly focused on a binary system and creating an expectation of, well, to be a man you sound like this, and to be a woman you sound like that, instead of addressing the client and saying, what are you comfortable with? Because you are valid, let's get you in a place where you feel great. How do you normalize trans inclusivity and trans inclusion and at the same time worry about matching cisgender protocol? That is hypocritical. I understand that there are some safety elements, of course, to go ahead and not look too out of place or whatever it may be, or too sound out of place or whatever it may be. So I totally understand why people would want to go ahead and look like this, walk like that, sound like this, and so on. I get that, but that should not be reinforced by a medical team, by a medical service. That is not health care. And I challenge that. And I got a letter written to me from Kevin A. Scott, the Chief Operating Officer, Deer Lodge Center, Meadow Church Home, and River Park Gardens. Allow me. Dear Taylor, thank you for providing your concerns regarding the education, resources, and handouts that were provided to you by the Speech Language Pathology Department at Deer Lodge Center. We recognize that some materials were outdated and did not convey an inclusive message to all individuals. We apologize for the negative experience that you had, and our team has made several steps in response. The one thing they have not done is apologize to the trans community, because I asserted to them that even though we don't know how much harm they caused, we can agree that there is a non-zero probability that the information that they provided and the services that they rendered has harmed someone somehow, some way. And they have not apologized for that because they feel that writing me a letter and keeping it to myself is more than enough. Newsflash, it sure as shit ain't WRHA, and this is a call out. Our forms, education, and training materials were reviewed and revised. Information from the GLAD website was closely reviewed. The Speech Language Pathology Department collaborated with Clinic Community Health to ensure the use of inclusive and diverse terminology in department materials and education sessions. The Speech Language Pathology Department has been engaging new clients on their experience in education and treatment sessions to determine if further changes can be made, by the way, to continue to promote inclusivity. Deer Lodge has struck a new committee focused on inclusivity and diversity. A representative from the Speech Language Pathology Department is part of this group. This individual will be a liaison between the community and the department to facilitate ongoing growth. Thank you again for bringing your concerns forward and advocating for improvements to the program. All of that sounds great on paper. Fundamentally, pretty cool. But if anyone knows me well enough, if you're going to do something, you do it right. Don't tell me you got it done until it's done. So, remember that last blurb here? Let's compare it to the actual one right off their website, which hasn't been updated since 2018, where if you're only getting a couple words in right there, see where it says transgendered with a capital T? Yeah. Just like transgenderism isn't exactly the right word, transgendered, we're not a condition. So we can go on and on and on about the hypocrisy of everything that they wrote and everything that Kevin A. Scott affirmed to me, except they can't do their own shit properly. So again, WRHA, this is your call out. Please address this and address me and let me know what you're doing about it. Trans people and young trans people in particular are struggling in Canada. Too many trans young people are struggling with unstable housing or no housing at all. 70% of trans kids have experienced sexual harassment, with more than a third of young trans kids having been physically threatened or injured in the past year. Too many young trans individuals have had discriminatory experiences while interacting with institutions meant to support them, such as the governments, to health and social services, to the education sector. Children's rights and trans rights exist at an intersection. Trans people and trans young people deserve their rights as young people, as trans people, as young trans people, to be recognized and affirmed. These rights should not and cannot be reactive in nature. This is taken from Transgender Day of Remembrance. Mourn for the dead, fight like hell for the living, by Faye Johnstone. Goes by they, she, 2S LGBTQIA+ educator and organizer based on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, Ottawa, Ontario. And this came with the Monitor. Rights aren't a competition. No trans individuals are going out saying that women shouldn't have rights. Trans individuals fairly unanimously are in favor of women's rights, trans rights. Legal experts have continuously debunked that notion, as in the women's rights erasure. The Canadian Bar Association in 2016 quite clearly articulated that there is no reasonable argument that trans rights infringed on women's rights. That is not how our legal rights structure works. TERF, or Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, rhetoric legitimizes this idea that trans individuals invade women's spaces and cisgender women should be fearful of this figure or phantom men in dresses. That ideology of rhetoric results in cis people in public looking at trans individuals strangely and harassing trans women. That legitimizes the acts of violence and harassment, and TERFs are contributing to that baseline of homophobia and transphobia and creating an environment where folks are more likely and empowered to target trans individuals in public. That's from Faye Johnstone. Just as a precursor to beginning to volunteer with Sport Manitoba and the Two-Spirit Transgender Non-Binary Committee, I was speaking with, I believe at the time, interim president Janet, and we were discussing the importance about this, and I brought up the fact that women's rights and the struggle that women have gone through from women's rights way back when, in the 60s, and that still goes on today. Under no circumstances is advocacy of mine trying to say, hey, don't worry about everything you did. What I have been saying is, why are we repeating all the same stuff that's happened? All of the same women's rights stuff about validity and existence and equality and equity. Why are we doing that again 50 and 60 years later? When it comes to this idea, going back to the phantom men in dresses and whatever, the TERF ideology creating those things, that is not a trans individual creating harm. They're amplifying stories on a nefarious individual using a trans affront because it's an easy scapegoat. They have nefarious intent and are using the ability they have to take advantage of a minority group that is getting torn up upon and pile it on in there so they can be nefarious but have someone else get blamed for it. So you know what I say about that? Here's my quote. You can't hyper-police nefarious intent. That same individual would use whatever is hot and popular in politics to do whatever malicious thing they plan on doing, regardless if it's based on gender, if it's based on race, if it's based on income, if it's based on class. That is a nefarious individual doing nefarious things. And for TERFs, and for people to believe TERFs, that individuals like that represent an entire community, wake up. If all you have known is privilege, then equity and inclusion can feel like oppression. But they're not the same thing. Being prevented from discriminating against someone isn't a loss of power for anyone who's behaving properly. That's from Adrienne Smith, a trans, non-binary social justice lawyer in Vancouver. Conversion therapy causes harm by reinforcing anti-trans and anti-gender, non-binary stigma and discrimination and creating social pressure on individuals to conform to identity and presentation that may not be consistent with their sense of self. A growing body of research shows that trans or non-binary gender identities are normal variations in human expression of gender. Attempts to force people to conform with rigid gender identities can be harmful to their mental health and well-being. Considering that in Canada we still haven't pushed Bill C6 through, I'd rather just get a quote from APA. And with that too, I do enjoy using material coming from places outside of Canada because, especially when we look at the Western world when it comes to anti-trans, particularly abuse, Canada, US, UK, they're all partying together anyway. So we may as well go ahead and take information from all of those places so that people from other locations can understand how things are in their backyard as well. People and groups were able to submit their support or opposition to Bill C6, a ban on forced conversion therapy. Conversion therapy, as I just mentioned, is the debunked practice of changing someone's sexual identity, or gender expression. The therapy can be provided by nearly anyone, from licensed psychologists, ministers, and life coaches, to name a few. It can fall under different names, such as gender critical therapy, reparative therapy, and sexuality counseling. There was a staggering amount that was sent to the Senate Committee on Justice, specifically from anti-trans TERF organizations referring to things like sex-based rights, leading to this idea that we're forcing people on a path towards medical transition without any choice, and this idea that trans individuals are corrupting children. These organizations often emphasize children's safety as a cover for their hatred and draw in parents and skeptics. From Faye Johnston. One submission in all of that reads, Bill C-6 will allow healthy bodies to be irrevocably damaged under false claims of gender identity that has no basis in science. No point of the submission offers any evidence to the claim, though. While Bill C-6 plans to ban forced conversion therapy, it does not give the government or anyone the power to forcibly make anyone undergo medical transition. Anti-trans ideology isn't new in Canada, but those who take this stance are getting louder and bolder. Many anti-trans groups, including those who oppose Bill C-6, brand themselves as women's groups, often used among anti-abortion groups, masquerading as feminist groups. They're all using the same language. It's all the same strategies of adopting the language of progressivism to push for regressive policies. And that's harmful because it misleads people. It's a pervasive political strategy, especially among more regressive groups, especially white ones, who are trying to defend some status quo and fight against change. And this is what's happening here. It's the same thing, the same playbook. That's from Florence Ashley, a jurist and bioethicist from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and the Joint Center for Bioethics. The ideas aren't necessarily new, but the difference is a lot of TERFs are becoming much more explicit about their beliefs and how vocal they are about it. And that is from Sebastian Roback, a researcher from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. There's been talk about how COVID has enabled and fueled the hate movements across the board with the connection between movements and racist white supremacist groups. Some opportunities have arisen through COVID-19 that TERFs and other hate groups have leveraged to recruit, to bring more folks on board and continue that narrative of trans individuals are attacking everybody. From Faye Johnstone. I have specifically said to people I know personally, and this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier when it comes to gender-affirming care. Regardless of what your stance is about COVID, amplifying and engaging yourself with anti-mask, anti-vax, associating or amplifying or creating a safe space, all you're doing in the big picture is you're amplifying hate, you're amplifying prejudice. You have no clue who you're partying with. More specifically, if you do have a clue, to be okay with supporting the concept of trans individuals not existing, that isn't cool. I'm so sorry. We should all be worried about the rise of the extreme right in Canada. The people protesting against COVID-19 vaccinations and against wearing masks are also using inflammatory language to discuss the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, especially and specifically trans individuals. PPC leader Maxime Bernier is actively campaigning to remove our hard-won hate speech legislation. We need to stand up together against this extremism. If you take a look at the PPC platform, very clearly, what's the word I'm looking for? A repeal of Bill C-16 and Bill C-6, or like to not have Bill C-16 go through, and to take away Bill C-16, which is protecting gender identity and gender expression from hate. So to have those same beliefs, and it doesn't matter if you voted for PPC or not, because ultimately we all know that strategic voting is that throwing a vote at PPC, probably a garbage vote, but you know you would if you could. And if you're okay with that principle of voting for your freedoms while eradicating the rights of someone's being is beyond me. That was from Trevor, I hope I pronounced it, Kirchner? I hope. Trevor, I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. The biggest issue that is facing 2S LGBTQIA+ people in Canada right now, as I see it, is the general acceptance of discrimination against us, especially that of trans individuals, and the rise of the anti-2S LGBTQIA+ hate. This hatred gets amplified by the PPC and some conservatives, as well as the anti-mask, anti-lockdown protesters. This discrimination and hatred get compounded by intersectionality for the racialized, disabled, and those living in poverty. This is not a surprise of the correlation between the PPC and their transphobic, let alone everything else, policies, and COVID. The amount of people who have been brainwashed by the beliefs, repeated by PPC and similar parties, for example, not recognizing that they have been nothing but pawns. All that the PPC party and similar mindsets in any sort of platform, they have been using this idea, oh, your freedoms are being taken away, your freedoms are being taken away. Remember what I was saying earlier, where if the only thing you knew was privilege, then equity feels like oppression? Yeah, same thing. So using this idea of taking care of the people around you as taking your rights away, and giving that space to the same party that is happy with eliminating the visibility of individuals like me, there's no justification to that aside from, holy shit, I didn't know, or, yeah, I know, I'm okay with that. There's no in between. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees to every individual equality before and under the law and freedom from discrimination based on sex. Both courts and human rights tribunals have long recognized that anti-trans discrimination is a form of sex-based discrimination. It targets people who experience discontinuity between the sex they got assigned at birth and the sex they identify with, meaning that governments cannot act in a way that unfairly disadvantages transgender Canadians without running afoul of the Charter's equality provisions. Federal and provincial human rights legislation extends these protections to the private sector. For example, the Alberta Human Rights Act prohibits landlords in the province from refusing a prospective tenant based on that person's gender identity, or gender expression. And the Ontario Human Rights Code similarly prohibits employers in provincially regulated industries like retail from targeting employees for harassment because of their gender identity or gender expression. But these protections are under attack. Across the country, anti-trans rights activists are trying to convince Canadians that guaranteeing equality to gender minorities is not only unconstitutional, but it also discriminates and harms cisgender women, that is, women who were assigned female at birth. Their misinformation campaign, disguised as a defense of women's sex-based rights, has become incredibly intense in the past year. These groups are deliberately misreading the Charter to legitimize their legally baseless assault on human rights legislation and the trans individuals that the legislation protects. Allowing this misinformation campaign to proceed unchecked has two main risks. The first is that members of the gender minorities under attack will become less likely to access the legal supports to which they are entitled when their rights are violated, out of mistaken fear that the justice system will not be on their side. The second is that anti-trans discrimination will increase in frequency and intensity because those opposed to trans rights will wrongly believe that such discrimination is consistent with constitutional law. Neither risk is tolerable if trans individuals have the assurance of their full and equal place in Canadian society. And that's written from Charlotte Dalwood on As Misinformation Campaign Against Trans Rights Intensifies, Ottawa Must Act. As I mentioned, Charlotte Dalwood, a Juris Doctor student at the University of Calgary, the Faculty of Law. In November 2019, the Manitoba government got ordered to start offering non-binary sex designations on its birth certificates. A human rights adjudicator has also called the province to pay $50,000 to a trans individual who wanted their sex designation on the birth certificate replaced with an X and got denied it. Manitoba's Vital Statistics Agency said all birth certificates have two options, male or female, under provincial law, and no other options allowed. The independent adjudicator, Dan Manning, who heard the case, ruled the government's position is discriminatory, and there is nothing under the law that would prevent a third designation from being offered, and said the seriousness of the province's actions towards the complainant was on the high end. Gender identity is a part of our concept of selfhood. The practice of Vital Statistics Director, Manitoba Finance Minister Scott Fielding, not to allow non-binary designations of sex designation and only permit male or female designations was effectively the government refusing to acknowledge the complainant's agency and personhood. The difficulties faced by trans and non-binary individuals in our society are many, and human rights tribunals have long recognized the disadvantages faced by trans individuals and non-binary individuals in society. The finance minister spoke out of turn, was transphobic, and cost the province $50,000. But if Scott Fielding, the Minister of Finance, recognized the law as the law actually is, could have saved the province $50K, because ultimately still had to go through all the processes to get the added designation on the birth certificate. So you still had to do the job, but you did it, costing $50,000 more, finance minister. The finance minister spending more money that's necessary because of transphobic behaviors. Not really a good finance minister, is it, finance minister? I'd love to know more. Still haven't replied to any of my other emails. Thanks for being a quality MLA. The mental health benefits of correct name use are well documented. A major 2018 study of trans youth, led by researchers at the University of Texas in Austin, found that the increased chosen name used by a single context, such as school, was associated with a 29% decrease in suicidal thinking. Florence Ashley wrote in 2016 about their experience with dead naming at McGill University. In case you just happen to not understand what dead naming is referencing a trans individual's name before their chosen name, right? It could say pre-transition name, could say previously legal name, could be whatever, right? My name is Taylor. Not only is it my legal name, it is my chosen name. My dead name is Brad. So an example like that. When Florence Ashley, as I said, wrote in 2016 about their experience with dead naming at McGill University, they say that technical issues are a poor excuse for institutions to ignore their human rights obligations. Essentially, they're citing convenience, and convenience is just not a viable human rights response in this area of law. The tech issue is an easy scapegoat, but it's also not a legally relevant one. Simple as that, especially when it comes to something like schools, organizations, in terms of applications online, or whatever it may be. The complications of getting your name changed, which on paper should be as simple as, hey, here's my name, help me update it, is far too complex for the fact that either organizations do not understand how to do that, or they're not interested in doing the work to allow it to be convenient. Either way, a person's name is valid, and disrespecting that is not acceptable. While there's undoubtedly been significant progress on 2S LGBTQIA+ issues since the Liberal Party formed government in 2015, through legislation protecting trans rights, an apology for the discriminatory purge of 2S LGBTQIA+ employees in the public sector, and new funding commitments to support 2S LGBTQIA+ community organizations, we are still facing crises on multiple fronts. Findings from Statistics Canada have highlighted significant income disparities, demonstrating that a pink ceiling on employment persists in our country. Many 2S LGBTQIA+ people still struggle to make ends meet, find affordable housing, and live free of discrimination. While hate crime tracking is far from adequate, all signs point to rising rates of hate-based violence targeting our communities. And that's from an article called Another Federal Election That Fails 2S LGBTQIA+ Communities from Faye Johnstone on this. The way political parties talk about our issues couldn't be more out of touch with the lived realities on the ground. Almost half of the trans individuals in Canada live either below the poverty line or very close to it. As much as 40% of the homeless youth population identifies as 2S LGBTQIA+. Our issues aren't window dressing. They are pressing and they are urgent. They are crises, and our political parties should treat them as such. The 2S LGBTQIA+ issues are election issues, and they matter to 2S LGBTQIA+ people. They matter to our allies. They matter to Canadians. It is past time for our political parties to move beyond tokenistic comments and deliver actual promises and proposals in the response to the crises in our communities and advance the rights, the health, and safety of 2S LGBTQIA+ people. I hope everybody got to see it. I was on CBC The National shortly before the election asking Aaron O'Toole about how he and his party plan to put an end to bigotry and transphobia in Canada. I'm going to put a link to that right up here so you can take a look at the episode to see how everything went. If you missed that first link, take a look at this one. This is my personal feedback to the experience. Actually, inside the body of the description of that link right there is going to have a little bit of storytelling, plus also a couple links to the episode itself. Taylor LaChrist, a trans woman from Winnipeg, brought up the issue of discrimination against people in her community, asking Aaron O'Toole how he would improve on the reality that she and people like her face daily. I'm very proud to say I was chosen to lead our party as someone with a clear record, being pro-choice and being an ally to the LGBTQ community, and I want to make sure all Canadians know as Prime Minister, I'll fight for their interests, O'Toole said. Chris responded that while O'Toole may share her belief that something has to get done to fight discrimination and acts of hatred in the trans community, people in his party do not feel that way. You also don't speak for everybody in your party, and that's a conflict of interest, a significant one as a matter of fact. O'Toole explained that when he won the leadership contest for his party, he wanted the Conservative Party to represent more Canadians, regardless of what community, including the LGBTQ community, and I want you to hold me to account for that, he said. It was a fun experience. Be more than happy to do something like that again. That said, I'm also in the middle of conversation with CBC about my representation on that episode. So again, if you missed that link earlier, here it is one more time. Definitely feel free to take a look at it of my feedback about the visibility that CBC created of me compared to how I presented myself to them. I feel it impacted not just the episode, but it very likely could have impacted the results of the election in some way, shape, or form. So, relevant. Most people are transphobic. 70% of Republican parents say that they'd be unhappy if their child's spouse identified as trans. About 30% of parents who say they are Democrats state that they would be disappointed if their child married a trans person. According to PRRI, around 48% of Americans would be uncomfortable with their child being trans. Only 60% of Democrats would be somewhat or very comfortable with their child being trans, meaning that 40% of polled Democrats would be overtly uncomfortable with their child living the truth. Freeze frame. All this stuff about the libs and the libs and trans and so on. It's across the boards, friends. Almost half. Like, this was in the States, but there's no question that Canadian politics and US politics are getting a little more blended in some areas, including trans. 48% of Americans would be uncomfortable with their child being trans, regardless of political bias. We want to talk about for the kids. There are parents who actively acknowledge they will struggle to love their child. 1 out of every 2 parents would have difficulty loving their child for who they are, regardless of political bias. This is nothing to do with the libs. This is nothing to do with the cons. This is everything to do with the adults who can't get over their own lives and wanting to live vicariously through their children because of their failed life. The amount of parents who put their lack of success and hope to see it go through their kids and hope to see some sort of success come through their children because they weren't able to create it themselves. And when their child is somebody that they never dreamed of being themselves and they choose to reject that child or struggle to accept them, 1 out of every 2 do not love the most important person they are to love. Take a step back and evaluate all of the day-to-day quotidian occurrences that highlight how weird and transphobic the public is. I'm talking about small gestures, like when your boss would rather you not use pronouns in email correspondence to clients, or when that guy you went to high school with loves tearing Caitlyn Jenner apart uncontrollably, ferociously, or when your favorite buddy loves Joe Rogan, who happens to go on regular tirades against trans athletes in his podcast, or when you pray to God that a consulting firm you're applying to doesn't learn you're trans so you can get the job, or when you can't find a priest for your Indian wedding. This was written by Isaac Ahmed, who's a trans man, a young professional in the DC area, wrote this for Washington Blade, and uses he, him, his pronouns. I want to just note the Caitlyn Jenner bit. I'm not a Caitlyn Jenner fan. That said, I respect Caitlyn Jenner's identity. She does not deserve transphobic abuse, regardless of her political stance or the things that she says or claims, even though she is essentially a hotbed of lateral violence within our own community. I am not happy with Caitlyn Jenner being a popular face for trans individuals, hardly being a representative, but unfortunately somebody that, if they're not familiar with a trans individual personally, is familiar with the name and attaches that behavior and that belief and that image as whole. Regardless of that, that does not take away her validity. A study has shown that most people who oppose trans rights and the Black Lives Matter movement incorrectly perceive reality. The research, conducted by the Policy Institute at King's College London and Ipsos MORI, is titled "The Fault Lines in the UK's Culture Wars." The majority of those who opposed the Black Lives Matter movement and thought trans rights had gone too far disagreed with factual realities. Among those who believed trans rights had gone too far, 67% were unable to correctly identify that trans individuals were twice as likely to be the victim of crime compared to the UK population as a whole, while 79% of those who supported expanding trans rights were able to understand that this was the case. I like the name of this article, actually. The majority who oppose trans rights and the Black Lives Matter movement have a warped sense of reality, according to science. Lily Wakefield, Pink News. Trust the science. In less than 5 months, 2021 has become the worst year in recent history for 2S LGBTQIA+ rights in the United States, with dozens of gay and transgender rights-related bills passed by state legislators. The HRC said that 18 anti-2S LGBTQIA+ state bills were signed into law this year, beating 2015 when 15 such bills got enacted in what it described as an unprecedented war against the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Pause for a second. Remember, 5 months. This specific article was written in May, and by May 2021, 18 bills versus 15 bills in an entire year. 7 laws restrict trans children from competing in sports, while others ban medical care for trans youth and allow parents to opt their children out of 2S LGBTQIA+ subjects in school. More than 250 2S LGBTQIA+ rights-related bills have been introduced by state legislators this year, reflecting a fiercely fought U.S. culture war between the 2S LGBTQIA+ advocates and conservatives, as well as some religious groups. These bills are not only harmful and discriminatory, but also represent a failure in our democracy and the commitment that elected officials made to protect and serve their constituents. Scott Fielding, you hear that? Works for you too. That was from Alfonso David, who's the president of the HRC. Across the U.S., 33 states have introduced more than 100 bills that Chase Strangio, I hope I pronounced that correctly, the deputy director for trans justice at the ACLU, argues have a clear-cut goal in totality: to stop people from being trans. Notably, the bulk of these bills focuses on kids. Some would prevent trans kids from using the restroom or locker room that corresponds with their self-identification. Some would ban trans kids from participating in same-gender youth sports. Others would outlaw gender-affirming healthcare for minors, and still others would essentially ban 2S LGBTQIA+ issues from being taught in classrooms. In April 2021, the Florida State House even passed a bill that would allow for genital inspections of transgender student athletes. Stop for a second. Ask yourself this. It doesn't matter how you feel in the world of trans rights or anti-trans or whatever. Are you okay with the idea of your kid and other people's kids being inspected by adults to verify their gender identity? Ask yourself if you're okay with that. And then ask yourself if that is the level of mentality that people let this get to stop trans people from existing. Look at yourself in the mirror. If you are an ally to the trans community, this should not be silent ever. And if you are against the trans community and you're okay with the idea of some stranger, or it could even be somebody you know, looking at your kids' bits to make sure they are who they're wanted to be by someone else, amazing. It is amazing. Where these, I'd love to call them brains, but brains require neurons and actual, competence to qualify as functioning devices. But how that gets allowed to just exist, to be talked about. In Texas, state lawmakers have introduced 12 bills to curb trans rights in that session alone. Kai Shepley, right off the top, pleaded with lawmakers not to pass a bill that would make it a crime to provide hormone replacement therapy, puberty suppression drugs, and medical or surgical procedures to anyone under 18. Another bill for consideration in Texas could allow Child Protective Services to remove trans children from their parents' custody. In other words, the very people who love to shout, "But what about the children?" are effectively endangering children's lives to own the libs. It's an article in GQ. This one I totally recommend checking out, just the same as all the others, but this one there's so much more with it, with a fantastic interview. It's called The Republican War Against Trans Kids by Saeed Jones. Please take a look at it in the link. I want to identify something very important in that article that I didn't bring to this, but I would like to just discuss because it was one piece in the interview. The principle of trying to stop people from being trans. What does that sound like? I do not want to ride on the coattails of an incredibly upsetting, I don't want to call it a discovery, but like a rediscovery of genocide that's been happening in Canada. I don't want to phrase a whataboutism. That's not my intention. But does that not sound like there's an attempt for eugenics or even genocide being done by these lawmakers to eradicate a very valid group of individuals? The enablement of these beliefs are so overlooked by all of our peers and all of our allies. As much as the trans community continues to insist that there are continued high effort attempts of trans erasure, and our peers and our allies and our systems to prevent that type of erasure from happening do not engage with stopping it. We went through an experience of recognizing that under all of our own noses, Canada allowed genocide. And to this day, we are still discovering terrible remnants of that. Is it not possible to learn from that and recognize that it's happening in a very similar yet incredibly different way and act on that now? Instead of talking about it later, our peers and our allies need to look past their noses about the world around them. Look at the puzzles and see the pieces getting put together and see that you've got the ability to recognize the big picture if you actually looked at it, instead of waiting for everything to get put together for you and then you reflect on it. I do not like spending my free time asking adults to make good choices. It makes me sad that some politicians use trans kids, like me, to get votes from people who hate me just because I exist. Again, from Kai Shepley, and I hope that name is pronounced correctly. I've said that a few times. Transgender 10-year-old from Austin, Texas. The crusade against trans athletes has been the most successful effort to introduce transphobic discrimination into state law after numerous states failed to pass larger-scale bathroom bills and puberty blocker bans in recent years. Trans athleticism is a seemingly complicated issue that has found success primarily to a mishmash of cultural attitudes and generally incorrect assumptions, particularly about trans girls' bodies. Anti-trans doomsayers often claim that simply allowing trans women and girls to compete at sports would destroy women's sports. But that narrative largely fails to hold up to real-world evidence. Trans athletes have been allowed in girls' high school and women's college sports for years, and no school has had to make a co-ed team, which is a dig that misgenders trans girls and women. Meanwhile, science has found that trans girls who hormonally transition at younger ages do not necessarily have a biological advantage athletically, as none of it justifies banning middle school trans girls from the local girls' soccer team. Advocates say laws that exclude and punish trans kids using messaging that classifies young girls as biological boys is scaremongering and unfair. It only seeks to reinforce ugly stereotypes about trans girls and women to an uninformed public. It's another attack on trans kids that potentially threatens not just their school life, but also their relationship with their parents, which advocates say is ultimately the goal for anti-trans conservatives, forcing trans kids back in the closet. One of my biggest principles of why I advocate strongly about trans inclusivity in sports is not about today. It is about getting the systems overall to fix their formatting, fix their like the documentation, fix the registration, everything for as early as levels as possible, like U8 soccer and whatever, and have the forms available so that the dialogue on it gives visibility to trans visibility, to non-binary visibility, to two-spirit visibility, so that that dialogue shows up as early as possible in everybody's lives. What that does is it allows a normalization, because sports is so rooted and ingrained in our culture. If there's anything that can create a mechanism of change, sports is usually one of the first places you can find large success out of it. By getting trans kids and the visibility of trans individuals normalized, that then also enables the ability for trans youth to grow up authentic and in sync with their gender identity, including having, if they find necessary, having medical interventions so that their bodies are aligned with their identity. What that means in people talk is, instead of me going through boy puberty, I could have gone through girl puberty. And what that would have meant is that I wouldn't have had the testosterone-based puberty developments as I was going through my younger ages. My body fundamentally would have been going through an estrogen-based development. I might have been this tall, who knows? But I know that there are masculine-ish features that would have not been as pronounced. Even for something as simple as voice, all of those things wouldn't exist. So this idea of trans youth having the same physiological features of a 23-year-old is a reflection of the ignorance that is being pushed to people who aren't thinking past the idea that their little sunshine might not get the game-winning goal. So that's why. Trans women were allowed to begin competing as women in the Olympics if they had bottom surgery starting in 2004. The surgery requirement was lifted in 2016 and replaced by guidelines stating that trans women must lower their testosterone levels for an entire year before eligibility. Despite the more open stance, no openly trans woman has ever qualified to compete according to their gender identity in the Olympics until Tokyo 2020, when we had Laurel Hubbard, who was the first open trans woman to compete. How many medals did Laurel Hubbard win? 0 is the answer. Laurel put in an excellent effort. No medals. No medals. No controversy. Weird system. Ultimately, being part of a team. Sports are a normal part of kids' socialization. Studies have shown that athletic participation provides all sorts of positive effects on children, from reduced rates of depression to positive physical health outcomes. But more importantly, high school and college sports are spaces for community building. Small towns often gather at the local high school's athletic events and socialize and build a common identity. By excluding trans kids from these spaces, it sends a clear message to all transgender kids that they don't belong. Behind all the grand pronouncements, Twitter trolls, and armchair experts are the authentic lives of trans kids who merely want to live everyday life without their transness making things weird or complicated. Fantastic article by Caitlin Burns, written on Vox, called "The Massive Republican Push to Ban Trans Athletes." This is a manufactured fear that the politicians pushing hope will be emblematic of a too swiftly changing culture. It is simply a wedge issue to drive between voters of one party or another. My concern is that the wedge that these bills will drive is not between voters and a political party, but between parents and their children. Cisgender people see a lot of the instantaneous results of the coming out process, so they assume that it's just a snap decision. They don't see the years of hormone therapy and the changes it does to a body. They just see the moment of public change and fear that some giant bodybuilder is going to do the same thing. I've spoken about this numerous times. Coming out as trans, you may gain your sense of self, but it doesn't come without consequence. As a trans woman and an athletic trans woman, do you think that I'm that desperate to invade sports, to win polyester t-shirts and stupid polyester towels and water bottles and ribbons and stupid shitty trophies you could probably find at Value Village in exchange for lack of privilege, for abuse, for threats, for hate, for violence. I can go on. Why would I go from being a white, cisgender, heterosexual male, Canadian athletic male to boot, top of the food chain, as I've said time and time and time again, where I can do everything that I want because I had every privilege I could ask for. And I'd be like, I want to get rid of all of that because I want to win some more tournaments. I want to go through all of these things that make life difficult. I want to go through these things where I have to put my mental health at full throttle of my capability, my competence, my management, my emotional regulation. I need to redline that 24/7 to take care of myself, to offset the hate and the abuse and the violence every day. I need to redline my conditioning to keep my quality of living okay. Why would I go ahead and put myself through all of that to win a t-shirt? To maybe hit a couple more home runs instead of some doubles and triples? Why would I do those things? Ask yourself, why would any trans individual put themselves through that much risk and consequence to invade a sport? Get over yourselves. It can be difficult to understand what it means to be trans, especially for those of us who have never met a trans individual. Trans athletes participate in sports for the same reasons as everyone else: to get and stay healthy, to be part of a team, to be part of a sport they love, and ultimately strive for excellence. When trans athletes get excluded from participation on teams that align with their gender identity, the result is they often are excluded from sports altogether. We shouldn't be keeping them off teams and barring them from playing simply because of who they are. That's written by Kathy Johnson-Clark, who's a gymnastics coordinator. I believe 2-time gold medalist off the top of my head. Trans women are women. Arguing that trans women are a threat to fairness or equality in women's sports isn't just transphobic. The argument is also built on a fallacy because women's sports aren't fair. For starters, sports aren't fair. One thing that I believe very strongly would help when it comes to inclusion in sports is an understanding that the word fair is very subjective to the individual using the word fair. Because if sports were fair, then you would have everyone pretty much as a biometric equivalent of each other being in the same leagues. But otherwise, all the other types of diversities are allowed, right? If women's sports were fair, all athletes would have equal access to competitive opportunities. If women's sports and sports in general were fair, that would mean doping isn't a concern. If women's sports were fair, that would mean women get paid equally. If women's sports were fair, that would mean women would get invested inequitably. And if women's sports were fair, that would mean women would have equal access to coaching and administrative opportunities. And if the women's sports were fair, sexual harassment and abuse wouldn't be an issue. There are plenty of threats to fairness and equality in women's sports, but those threats don't include trans women. That's written from Alex Azzi from On Her Turf on NBC Sports. Please take a look at the link. It's from On Her Turf. Another fantastic, huge article with a lot of extra embellishments to all of those little points of women's sports are fair because. Again, every link that I've shared so far has extra information. Please create the time to look through them. That is one that I can think of where I took the headers to build a paragraph out of that because the amount of extra information there is fantastic. It was so well written. 20 red states sued the Biden administration for the right to discriminate against trans individuals. The states are suing the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, and the Department of Education, the DOE. They say that the DOE issued unauthorized guidance to schools telling them that they can't discriminate against trans students and that the EEOC went beyond its mandate when it issued guidance that said it's discrimination to prevent trans employees from using the restroom of their gender or forcing them to follow the dress code of their sex assigned at birth. The states that joined the Tennessee-led lawsuit are Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, and West Virginia. Back to Canada. Members of the trans and non-binary communities say that they're seeing concerning signs that transphobic ideology is worsening in Canada. Anti-trans sentiments are not new to the country, but several factors make this moment in our time fraught, say activists and educators. That's even though the federal government moved to protect the rights of trans individuals in 2017 with the passing of Bill C-16, which made gender identity and expression a protected human rights category. Recent media coverage, including a story by CTV News investigative program W5 and opinion columns published by the Toronto Star and CBC, has been criticized by members of the trans community for pushing transphobic ideas and misrepresenting the dangers they face daily, which include violence and poor mental health due to discrimination. Among the concerning messages are assertions that trans individuals who have not undergone transition-related surgery are not real men or women, or falsely paint trans women like dangerous men, say critics. That article, by the way, that I referenced, I'm going to have a couple quotes in there too, arguably the most hypocritical thing that CBC could have put on their own site. The material that I've taken out of it is advocate-worthy material. But the fact that CBC first strips my visibility for my segment about bigotry and transphobia during my conversation with Erin O'Toole, which was on national TV, they completely eradicated my visibility. I'm just going to put it up there again in case you haven't seen it yet. But they eradicated my visibility, which I claim to be transphobic because, I'm more than sports and karaoke, but hey, what do I know? And then they published this opinion from Jessica Treff, who I personally am confident is a sock, but hey Jessica, if you're out there and you're real, then all I can really say is please talk to somebody, because your internalized transphobia is leaking rather hard. But for CBC to go ahead and then do that and then post an article about, wow, the media is really kind of screwing up when it comes to transphobia lately, what do we do about that? Bonkers. The climate for trans individuals has improved in the last decade considerably, but we're starting to feel some of those waves in anti-trans activism that has taken hold in the United Kingdom and the United States in recent years. That's from Travers, goes by one name, professor of sociology from Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, BC. Research commissioned by the UK's press regulator concluded trans news stories have grown 400% since 2010 and have become more strident and heated. Between 2012 and 2019, the number of British news stories about trans topics increased by 250%. While the proportion of anti-trans coverage remains similar, more media reporting means there are quantifiably more negative stories than a decade ago. And as I've said earlier, thank you, Owl, for this, anti-trans groups get an incredible amount of space in public discourse and the media. I know I've written this in the description of there being a content warning for this. Thank you for everyone who's got this far so far. There's lots, right? There's lots. This is my life 24/7. How do you pack 24/7 for 365 days into a couple minutes, right? So thank you for hanging through. As I mentioned, there's a content warning in the description. I am now going to share. I want you to hear me say this. There are links that are in the description about this specific article. The language used is horrendous. It is difficult. If you're having an okay day, don't look at it. If you're having a horrible day, you've seen enough already. The language used is horrendous. And the fact that the BBC amplified that position is worse. An anti-trans activist recently quoted in a controversial BBC article posted online advocating for violence against trans women and called for them to get lynched. Lily Cade, a lesbian porn star who apologized amid a series of sexual assault allegations in 2017, was featured in a controversial BBC article that claims trans women pressure lesbians into sex. Cade continued to argue that trans women are not women and said that if it were up to her, she'd execute every last one of them personally. Since the BBC published its article on October 26, 2021, it's faced massive backlash for the piece, which many have called transphobic and dangerous. Following the article's publication and subsequent backlash, Cade has started posting extreme calls to violence against trans women on her blog. On an update, I didn't put it in here, there have been nothing unlike what happened with Netflix and Dave Chappelle. BBC did not, they fundamentally didn't apologize for doing that. They've tweaked the article slightly, but they have not owned the harm that they have caused. And trans employees at BBC have been quitting. While that's excellent for those trans employees to recognize their value and to save themselves from being in a transphobic workplace, what that's also doing, and it's not to put the responsibility back on these trans employees, of course, but now there are less trans individuals in the BBC to keep any of that shit at bay. a difficult paradox, because you're not going to have this revelation from their management to go like, oh, we're losing a bunch of employees because of stuff we've done. Oh, well, we'll just hire more employees who won't argue with us. This is the state of our media. This is the state of our world. Any week where a mainstream news publication publishes a questionably sourced, misleading, and transphobic media piece is terrible. But a week where 3 of Canada's most prominent and most respected media outlets publish misleading articles about trans individuals, that's a terrible week. One that points to a worrying trend in Canadian media. These pieces and the editorial decisions to run them are all worthy of critique on their own. But taken together, they paint a narrative reminiscent to the wave of anti-trans so-called feminism out of the UK, championed by the country's media and celebrities like author J.K. Rowling. For trans individuals and allies in Canada, at a time when far-right anti-trans parties like the People's Party of Canada garner more than 800,000 votes, which, by the way, in case you didn't know, is 5% of everybody who voted, that 800,000 people represented 5%, or just over 5%. Of voters. In a federal election, it's concerning to see these dangerous narratives given mainstream platforms. I want to revolve back to that PPC thing one more time. 5% of Canadian voters supported an anti-trans platform. 0.24% of Canadians are trans. Look at that intersection of why trans allies have to speak up. But if there's 0.24% of Canadians is trans, and that means that there's 5% of individuals hoping to not see a trans person around, if I'm doing rough math correctly, that would then mean for every 1 trans person, there are 20 people against them. So it's a 20-to-1 fight for every single one of us. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that do you understand now why there needs to be allies really stepping in? Because it's not a 1-to-1 battle. It's not a 1-to-1 battle. It'll never be a 1-to-1 battle. It's 20-to-1. Every day that I wake up, I'm fighting against 20 people that wish I didn't. And if you can at least back me up, then it's 2 of us, which means I only need to deal with 10 and you only have to deal with 10. But I got your back as long as you got mine. Understand this ratio, and then maybe you'll really grasp why this is so important to pay attention to. This is the awareness part of Trans Awareness Week, of recognizing the world, not just what you understand of it. Anti-trans voices have an outsized impact on the trans community. The problem is the people who are inclusive of trans individuals, primarily in practice, have a neutral effect on the lives of trans individuals. The best that they do is not be transphobic, not interfere with the well-being of trans individuals. In contrast, the people who are against trans individuals are very negatively impacting them. And that's from Florence Ashley. And I love this. Thank you so much for saying this, Florence. So it's 20-to-1. As a trans ally, we're going to go to a sporting event. Let's say wrestling for fun. And I'm in one corner. And then in the other corner, there's a stable of 20 people. And now you get to go ahead and join the mix. Right now, the decision that you're most likely taking is to have ringside seats and a big foam finger. And I'll tell you right now that for every ally who thinks that's going to be enough, return the ticket, return that foam finger, and stop giving me this idea that you're supportive. Because the thoughts and prayers isn't enough. The thoughts and prayers doesn't stop hate. The thoughts and prayers doesn't create change. The thoughts and prayers does shit. It does shit. The fight ends when the fight is over, not when you're done fighting. And I get through my day, and whether or not I want to, I'm in a climate that is a fight. I don't have a choice to decide when it's done, but I can tell you when it's over. So either you're fighting with me or you're watching me fight. And it's up to you to decide who you're going to be in that position. Are you going to get in the corner and get in the ring with me? Or are you just going to go ahead and wait for me to get thrown out of the ropes and you can slap me on the back and tell me to get back in and try harder? Because that's what the world is right now. I've had my back slapped enough and I need somebody in the corner. I'm heartbroken because I recognize what seeing that in the media or seeing that message or seeing that narrative does to those kids who are literally, honestly, just trying to go out and be welcomed and safe and affirmed in the world. We're exhausted from constantly having to debate our existence. And we're exhausted by constantly having to self-advocate in the face of ignorance. Trans women are women, trans men are men. If people can just keep that in their minds and go forward with that thought, then we might get somewhere. Progress takes time, but it should not end with us going back in time. as from Anna Murphy, a trans woman, and 2S LGBTQIA+ activist in Calgary. Say what you will about the whole journalism school rigmarole, but if there was one thing I took away from every single media ethics course, it was not to cause harm. It's a lesson taught in J-school classes and student newspaper meetings and everywhere else. And budding journalists come through the pipeline. Do not cause harm. Report the truth, be fair, but do not cause. That's from Mel Woods. The Domano Star piece needlessly posits feminism as a binary between trans and women's rights, with the former coming at the latter's expense. The Jessica Triff CBC piece goes against the corporation's public journalism standards and practices, which outline that opinion must not misrepresent other points of view. It's full of unsubstantiated claims and does not engage with the existing scientific literature on how you can be trans, even without medical interventions. And the CTV story perpetuates a dangerous and false narrative that transition is something that a lot of kids regret. Outlets like these can hire, promote, and pay trans writers and editors in meaningful, non-tokenized ways. We're tired of waking up to see what transphobic nonsense is burning up Twitter this time. We're tired of watching outlets platform these ideas. Increasingly, it's more than just hurt feelings at stake. It's our lives. As I've said to Aaron O'Toole, there is a non-zero and escalating probability of being a victim of a violent or fatal assault for being who I am. And that doesn't end so long as this type of behavior is allowed and or enabled. There is a responsibility from allies and media to mitigate this hate. A pair of guides released by the Transgender Law Center, the TLC, seeks to establish best practices for journalists who may not have had any prior experience on reporting on trans communities as issues affecting marginalized people enter mainstream discourse. One guide pertains specifically to anti-trans youth athletic bans, and the other gets aimed at coverage on bans on trans medical care. There are more resources now than ever before dedicated to ensuring that trans stories are told accurately and fairly, including the Trans Journalists Association Style Guide. While the impetus for them may be grim, the existence of these guides bodes well for future transgender media coverage, so long as it gets applied. The one thing that I feel is important, and I've brought this up numerous times, and as much as it's snide, it is what it is. The media is a business, and if you're not sensational, you're not doing your business right, because the media gets its revenue by attention. And if the revenue isn't being generated by attention, which typically comes from sensationalism, the media is not being profitable. As much as the media likes to paint itself as having a responsibility of sharing the news that all people need to hear, they are in principle a business. They are trying to make money, and they make money by selling newspapers, or they make money by getting people to visit their websites, which have advertisement banners on there, which generates revenue in terms of advertising funding. So the guides are fantastic, except for the fact that the principle of writing the article is not of the interest of the media as a whole, because they're not going to have a cost benefit, as opposed to being a sensational or transphobic piece. And until that changes, until that understanding of we can't compromise the quality of living for others because we want to make money, until that changes, it will continue to happen regardless. If there's 2 guides, 200 guides, tour guides, whatever. So that needs to be fundamentally recognized. Media as a business is intentionally creating harm so they get theirs. There is no amount of ignorance happening at CTV, at CBC, Toronto Star, BBC. Those aren't oopsie doodles. Those are full intention, cost benefit analyses, decisions. And that is important to recognize before any sort of request for change happens. Making money on creating harm is a flawed policy, and that must be addressed. A recent study has shown a link between news coverage of trans issues and increased youth referrals to gender identity clinics. But those studying and working with trans youth and children, including the study's authors, say that more attention needs to get drawn to the tremendously harmful effects of negative media coverage on trans youth and the lack of education on gender identity. The study examined news items between 2009 and 2016 that mentioned trans issues and correlated with the number of referrals to gender identity clinics in Australia and the UK. It found that within 2 weeks of the appearance of a media piece directly related to or entirely focused on trans issues, there was an increase in referrals to these clinics. This reliance on the media points to a significant problem in our education system. Many things have changed over the past 10 or 15 years and beyond, but the school system is still binary. I want to put really quickly in here, right, that even though it is a citation from a scientist, I believe it would be more appropriate to use words like largely, primarily, popularly, because I even know firsthand, I've just seen little one-offs of, of examples of having a little more gender diversity included. But fundamentally, as an overall whole, that what is being described is pretty much the systems altogether, not acknowledging individual teachers or ECEs or so on. So I want to put that as a really quick preamble to this. School system, still binary. Little kids pick up on these things at a very, very young age. In nursery school, it's all heteronormative, and the stories that get read to children are all cisgender. In kindergarten, gym class gets divided into boys and girls, and it's teaching children that there are only gender identities there are. There are very, very easy ways to talk to young children about these things, but we keep saying, we can't possibly do this, they're too young. What's funny with that is that by also enforcing a gender binary, you are talking to children about it already. You are just deciding what you would prefer them to understand. Little kids are sponges. They'll absorb whatever you tell them. So if we replaced all of those binary books and replaced it with nothing but gender diversity, it's the exact same conversation. It has nothing to do about age. It's about what you choose to sell them. So do you want to keep selling those wares, or do you want to improve the quality of your product? It's as simple as that. Cisnormative society at large can get pretty aggressive in its erasure of trans existence, preventing us from existing by blocking access to gender-affirming healthcare, forcing us into conversion therapy, barring us from public life by enacting legislation against us, and relegating us to the margins through employment and housing discrimination. These anti-trans powers also create images to mock us or stoke fear about us, making trans individuals into monsters or the butts of raunchy jokes. Dave Chappelle, hi, bye. Seriously, if Dave Chappelle's jokes got any lazier, he literally wouldn't have put his pen to paper. But anyway, that's aside from the point. That's my Dave Chappelle moment. Like the rest of my generation, I grew up with Norman Bates and Buffalo Bill, Lieutenant Einhorn, and the Crying Games Dill. The traumatic effects of having these disturbing stereotypes be your only points of reference for who a trans individual is cannot be overstated. You grow up believing that transness is a disgusting, dirty secret, a fetish, a scandal, a crime. Throughout 2020, we were as visible as possible, and oftentimes not even by our own intent. We were as visible as possible, lights shining grossly bright on us from every stage wing. We were assumed omnipresent in public toilets and women's sports, pediatric clinics, controlling the media and mobbing people on Twitter. Every magazine, newspaper, and podcast wanted to talk about us. Many of us are tired of being visible. We want action. Visibility is a lot more palatable than action. And if you unfocus your eyes, you might even be able to confuse the former for the latter. Because of how successful anti-trans propaganda has been, the public has begun to believe that even an invocation of the trans community is a form of political activism. We've become so tainted by the tiny scope of the political field our opponents have relegated us to that we can no longer see the bigger picture. While it can be emotionally invigorating, a sympathetic nod should not be confused with a helping hand. The simple acknowledgement is not an action in itself. It's only a precursor to the movement supposed to follow. Putting up branded billboards letting others know that you've seen the mythological sinking ship, but it won't stop sinking until someone comes to fish it out of the deep, dark depths. How long until we shift our activism away from visibility and move on to something a little bit more substantial? How long until allies stop waving at us from the safety of the sidelines and start helping us out of the wreck? Fantastic piece written by, again, a name, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Noor Abi Nakul, a trans individual living in Montreal, wrote this for Extra, called Trans Folks Need More Than Just Visibility. The NBJC, as I mentioned earlier, National Black Justice Coalition, urges others who also care about the dignity and safety of trans individuals to do what they can to be better advocates, including raising awareness in their communities and supporting organizations working on the ground to combat the ongoing epidemic of violence. While 2S LGBTQIA+ activists raise the alarm about the threats facing trans individuals each year, allies can play an essential role in ensuring that more lives aren't lost. The increase in violence against trans individuals is devastating and yet unsurprising. We've repeatedly seen that BIPOC trans individuals are among the first targets of violence and discrimination. There remains an urgent and pervasive need for allies to prevent further violence by working on expanding access to safety and opportunity to trans individuals. It's coming from Andy Mara, the Executive Director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Allies need to step up and make their presence known. You need to support trans individuals just as loudly and if not even louder than others hate us, because they're just being there, not discriminating. That's unfortunately not enough to undo and outweigh the harm that's being done by those who hate us. Another fantastic quote, and I love this, from Florence Ashley. 1 against 20. 1 against 20. Being there, not being part of the 20 is not helpful. Being there, being supportive, not being part of the 20 is mostly not helpful. Get in the ring. Get in the bring your friends. That's what you do. You don't just get in the ring and then be my one partner and now it's 2 against 20, which is better than 1 against 20. But you bring your friends, you call your friends, you get on the phone and you bring in another 18 people, and then you get those 18 people to bring their friends. That's how it works. As an ally, you need to bring everything you got. If everything you got is you, that is fantastic. But if you have more and you're not bringing more, you're not doing enough. You gotta step up, because you know damn well that if you ask me to step up for you, I'm in. And why am I in? Because I know that if I need you to have my back, I gotta show you I got yours. So step up and be up. And bring everybody with you, please and thank you. We need to do better. We need to set a new standard on trans health and safety and rights in Canada. Trans young people are struggling in this country and we are complicit through our silence, through our ambivalence. How do you support trans young people? Here's some suggestions provided by Faye Johnston. 1. Attend a TDOR vigil in your community. As I mentioned, November 20th. You can set it on the calendar, find one in the community. Donate to a trans-led organization or a 2S LGBTQIA+ organization with a demonstrated commitment to trans communities. In Winnipeg, off the top of my head, I'll give you 2 to choose from: Clinic and Rainbow. Bring trans inclusion into your workplace. Bring a trans educator or inclusion expert to build the awareness and knowledge of your team. Reach out and build relationships with trans people in your community who are on the front lines of our fight for justice. And most importantly with that, ask them what they need, like bringing your friends. They know their local communities best and demand more action from your leaders, city councillors, and provincial and federal parliamentarians. We need our allies to be more vocal, more demanding. We need advocates working by our side to create truly trans-inclusive classrooms, workplaces, families, and communities. We need our allies to demand that our governments do more and allocate more funding specifically for trans communities and trans young people. We need a real commitment to action. And again, thank you to Faye Johnstone for a fantastic list of suggestions for allies wondering, what do we do? What can we do? How do we help? J.K. Rowling's denial of scientific, biological, medical facts has a horrific real-world impact on people's lives. As Daniel Radcliffe stated himself after her lengthy transphobic post in June 2020. According to the Trevor Project, 78% of trans and non-binary youth reported being the subject of discrimination due to their gender identity. It's clear that we need to do more to support trans and non-binary individuals. Gender exists upon a spectrum or even a mosaic. But there seems to be an apparent need to start at the basic principles of biology and work our way up from there, including acknowledging that 1 in every 100 Americans are intersex, meaning that they have any combination of male and female sex tissue or hormones. Most of my trans friends are tired of explaining their identity, and I often receive looks of puzzlement when I disclose that I'm cisgender. For the record, this is from Fiona Dawson. But why we other our trans family by expecting them to label themselves as trans and not expect a cisgender person to share that their cisgender is questionable. But we're often talking about sex, which is visible between our legs, usually, and kind of personal information, actually, to be shared with the world. At the same time, gender is between the ears, i.e. wired in our brains. Gender, something that both cisgender and trans individuals have, is three things. Whom you know yourself to be, how you express yourself to the world, and how the world sees you. Fiona has a fantastic YouTube link that I'm going to attach right here. And feel free to check it out. It's a little 2-minute how-to about sex and gender. Fiona Dawson is an Emmy-nominated and award-winning filmmaker. That piece was written for LGBTQ Nation. Fantastic article as a whole. Here are 4 ways for cisgender individuals to be the best trans allies possible. 1, know yourself. 2, consider others. 3, be kind. 4, be courageous. Be kind resonates with me. If you know, you know. Have the ability to define cisgender. We often focus on gender identity and expression as traits unique to the trans community, but all human beings, including straight cisgender people, have a gender identity and presentation. Consider how you fall within the spectrums of gender and sexual orientation. Remember that coming out as trans is very different from lesbian, gay, bi+, or any other sexual orientation, but 77% of trans individuals identify as something other than straight. People of all sexual orientations have gender expressions that get perceived in different ways. When I came out, socially, I was asked frequently as, if I like men now. And I'm like, no, I still like women. And having that moment of recognizing, of being like, oh yeah, no, I guess I'm lesbian now too, was kind of a funny, oh yeah, no, I guess that also was add that to the mix. Now, what the point of that is, and I want to just bring kind of remind everyone what coming out as trans is. It's perceived very different than coming out as a sexual orientation that's not straight. If one was to say, I'm gay, it's like, okay, so you like people of your same sex in the bedroom. Okay, that's your bedroom life. But if you come out as trans, there is a recognition that your entire foundation of life is potentially different. Sex does not equal gender. I'm going to put it up here one more time. The first misunderstanding is when we get hung up on our junk, but genitals do not predict your sexual orientation or your gender. People have been assuming incorrectly that our sex, i.e. what's between our legs when we're born, tells parents that they have a baby boy or girl. But that's not true for everyone. Hi, that's me. Which make gender reveal parties utterly ridiculous. Completely agree. By all means, have a fun pregnancy party. Sure, completely agree. But why we need to say what the baby's genitals look like is way TMI. Speaking of, please don't talk about our privates. My friend Kate's from Honduras, and she's a trans woman, and I am a cisgender woman. Again, they're written by Fiona. We're both immigrants, we both have siblings, we're both ambitious, we both take risks, and we both are women. We're just born with different genitals between our legs, and that is very personal. So neither of us should have to explain what's in our pants. Use your privilege. When our gender meets society's expectations, we experience an easier time in the world. Those of us who easily conform have an opportunity to speak up for those whose gender does not neatly fall into one of society's silly little boxes. Learn about the spectrum of others. Generally, all people have a label for their gender, including agender, for the feeling of having no gender, and those labels help express whom we know ourselves to be. But how someone appears on the outside is not necessarily how they feel on the inside, nor is it reflective of the body they were born with, which is, quite frankly, none of our freaking business. But what we can do is listen. So many brave people share their stories in multiple ways, such as online, on podcasts, and in books. We can learn from hearing other people's life experiences, and often they help us navigate our own. Be mindful that you don't know what you don't know, but there's always the opportunity to learn through active listening. Be empathetic. I don't know what it feels like to be trans, says Fiona. I definitely do. But I do know what it feels like to get seen as someone you're not. To varying degrees, practically all people, including straight cisgender people, understand feelings of anxiety, depression, fear, powerlessness, and being othered. We can also relate to being respected, influential, worthy, loved, and included. Even though our circumstances are different, we can empathize with other people's emotions and show kindness and courage in our actions. Politely ask someone's pronouns and not their preferred pronouns. Asking about pronouns isn't like asking for someone's wine preference, right? My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Not a preference. Those are my pronouns. An easy dialogue is to share yours first. For example, my name's Fiona. My pronouns are she, her. May I know your pronouns too, please? Put your pronouns on video calls, email signatures, and introduce yourself with your pronouns regardless of who is attending the meeting. We can never assume someone's identity by the way they look. Practice patience with everyone in your life. Being patient with someone who's questioning or exploring their gender identity is extremely important. As no human is born with a manual, it can take a while for all of us to figure ourselves out. Like cisgender people, trans individuals' paths to know and express themselves are unique and personal. There's no right or wrong way to transition, but there are right ways to be supportive, like affirming someone's experience. Use gender-inclusive language always. Once you realize how we're perpetuating sexist language, it's hard to unhear. We've been using gender-neutral language our entire lives as well, though. So, for example, I have a plumber coming to my house today, but I don't know when they'll be here. There are tons of listicles on the internet giving words to use instead of, hey guys, as a greeting. Hey y'all is my favorite. Speak up, seriously. Silence is complicit. Being a badass trans ally is rooted in using your voice in whichever form suits you best to not only call out violence and discrimination, but to help educate those who don't understand and are fearful of difference. Whether sharing books, films, or viral videos with loved ones, having tough offline conversations, or backing someone up in public, being an upstander is critical for trans equality. Those who have gotten oppressed never won the rights of a minority without the support of the majority. When you mess up, say you're sorry and move on. The best intention of us mess up, but don't rub salt in the wound by making your slip up the focus of the conversation. The trans individual you're talking with doesn't need an explanation of how hard you're trying or how difficult it is for you to use their name, and they need you to keep doing your best because practice makes perfect. What I will say, as a little star beside things, oh, it's so tough to remember your name. But how quick do you remember your best friend's new last name after they get married? Just ask yourself, is it difficulty remembering to use the name? Or is it difficult to understand the importance of consistently doing that? Create a platform and know when to take a seat. Not all trans individuals want to explain or educate about their lives and bodies to the world, but some trans individuals do. I'm comfortable with speaking candidly. Many trans individuals don't have that same openness that I do. To use for an example, finding a balance between being a vocal advocate and not taking a stage when a trans person should be is a callback to our self-awareness. I want to rewind 2 sentences, if I can, of the trans person stepping out of the way. I want to establish how I feel Fiona is trying to explain from that, in the sense where it is very easy for a trans individual to not obtain that goal or that target and get dismissed from it, and then also be told reasoning that is not described as transphobic. Let's just say myself and somebody else who is cisgender were applying for a similar job and both of us had similar qualifications. There could be a laundry list of reasons why that potential employer could choose why they would have a preference in that other individual, following HR, of course. But they could validate it for some of the simplest, weirdest, oddest reasons, even though fundamentally that they're like, oh, well, you know, that's a trans individual and it's just going to be a PR nightmare, so we probably shouldn't hire her. Removing the opportunity to lose that potential because of discrimination-based reasons is what's being asked. It's not saying sacrifice your self-worth. It's recognizing that your opportunities are so much more frequent and frankly easier. It's still going to come around. Now, I'm going to say straight up that if you don't have work and you're starving and you're trying to get a job, fight for the job. I'm going to say that straight up as a human being. But I am saying is that, like, if you like using this as an example, if you're doing something like career hopping and you're still stable and you've got your income and everything's good, but you just want to get a change of scenery, please don't take that opportunity away from a trans individual who's literally looking for work. because they're struggling to get a job because they're trans. That's kind of the messaging that I believe Fiona is trying to say there. I'm going to put right here a link to the It Gets Better project. They have a playlist from Trans Awareness Week. I remember seeing it from last year, so if it's the same playlist by the time this video is uploaded, fantastic. It might even be evolved with some even more videos, but it's a fantastic piece of contributions from the trans community, so you can just get better visibility and better understanding about trans individuals as a whole. I would like to close this with a reminder to look in the description of this video and take a look at the action page from New Mode. And please take 14 seconds to add your voice to inspire meaningful change. Literally click on the link for the campaign for the Hire Weller project, and it's name, email address, postal code. The letter's ready to go. Hit send, and it goes to all the political leaders in your area and help send that message. Please don't hesitate to share this video. Feel free to hit some likes on it so that we can also get some visibility on platforms I choose to put this on to just help boost the messaging and awareness. I know it's a long video, but there's so much to talk about over the course of a year, literally, and it's a day in my life. Everything that I've talked through is literally a day-to-day experience. And I appreciate you making it all the way through. Over here, I will put a playlist for Hire Weller and Dwell on It, which are weekly uploads that I do on our Grassroots Instagram page, and I put it on my own YouTube channel as well, of questions that individuals ask me for, about my lived experience as a trans woman. Feel free to dive in and check that out. Feel free to subscribe to me, right? Anytime I put new content, right? It'd be great to go ahead and have more people see what's up, see what's new. Feel free to let me know that you joined, and be more than happy to continue to share my lived experience with you. And let's just act, please, because this is an important time. This is in 40 years of my life, this has been an amazing year, both in a personal journey and also just an amazing year in not such a positive word of how our social and political climate has been to trans individuals, and that needs to change, and it won't change without your. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. Please share this. Please share this. Please share this. Please get this to as many people in as many ways as you can. Please share this. Take this video and share this on all of your platforms. And please let everyone know that if they're able to commit time to watch Netflix for an evening or a movie, do me a solid. I know this isn't the most entertaining, funny, hilarious, graphically enthusiastic stuff, but I said this to you because I need you to hear me. And I'm telling you that if you said the same thing to me, I would be listening. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your care. Thank you so much for your support. Happy Trans Awareness Week. And remember, the Trans Day of Remembrance, November 20th. I should share this for fun for one little bit. I got my nails done, and you'll notice a little black band. That's for Trans Day of Remembrance. So I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you so much.